In the ancient city of Alexandria, on the northern coast of Egypt, there stood a building that the ancient world considered the most important structure on earth. Not the most beautiful, not the most sacred, not the most powerful in the military or political sense. The most important, because it contained something that every civilization in the ancient world understood to be more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, more dangerous to those who wish to control the human mind than any weapon ever forged: knowledge. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world. Estimates of its holdings range from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. It contained works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, history, poetry, and natural science from every civilization that had been in contact with the Mediterranean world. And it is gone. Every scroll, every text, every piece of knowledge it contained, destroyed. This much most people know. What most people do not know is the part of this story that has been almost completely absent from the standard historical account. Not what was burned first. Because the destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not a single event. It was a process. A long, deliberate, carefully managed process that spanned centuries. And that had a specific logic, a specific target, a specific category of knowledge that was identified as the most dangerous and therefore the first to go. Not the mathematics, not the astronomy, not the medicine or the poetry or the natural science. Something else, something that the people who ordered the burning understood with a clarity that modern historians have been slow to acknowledge, was the most powerful knowledge in the ancient world. The knowledge of consciousness, the inner technologies, the maps of the human psyche that the ancient world had spent thousands of years developing, and that the library had gathered from every civilization that possessed them. Tonight, we recover what was burned first. To understand what was destroyed in Alexandria, we need to understand what Alexandria actually was. Because the Library of Alexandria was not simply a storage facility for books. It was the intellectual center of the ancient world. And it was built in a very specific location for a very specific reason. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE on the northern coast of Egypt. Alexander had just conquered Egypt, and he chose this site for his new city with characteristic strategic intelligence. It was positioned at the intersection of 3 worlds: the Greek world of philosophical and scientific inquiry, the Egyptian world of the most ancient and sophisticated wisdom tradition in the Western world, and the broader world of the ancient Near East with its Babylonian astronomy, its Persian mystical traditions, its Hebrew prophetic literature. Alexander's intention, and the intention of his successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was to gather the knowledge of all of these traditions in one place. Not merely to catalogue it, not merely to preserve it, to synthesize it. The Library of Alexandria was, at its height, the most ambitious attempt in human history to understand reality as a whole, to bring together the Egyptian mystery school tradition, the Greek philosophical schools, the Babylonian astronomical records, the Persian cosmological systems, the Indian mathematical and philosophical texts, and to find the common thread that ran through all of them, And what the librarians and scholars of Alexandria found when they began to read across traditions, when they began to compare the Egyptian understanding of the soul with the Greek philosophical analysis of consciousness, when they began to find the same mathematical structures appearing in Babylonian astronomy and in Pythagorean geometry, when they began to recognize the same descriptions of the nature of awareness in the Indian Upanishads and in the Egyptian mystical texts, was something that should not have been possible. All of these traditions developed independently, in different languages, in different centuries, in different parts of the world, were describing the same reality, from different angles, with different symbolic systems, in different outer forms, but the same reality, the universal nature of human consciousness, the same inner territory that the sacred flame channel has been mapping across all these conversations, the territory of what a human being actually is at the deepest level had been described with extraordinary precision and consistency by every major civilization that the Library of Alexandria had gathered knowledge from. And this convergence, this recognition that the ancient world had collectively developed a complete and consistent map of the nature of consciousness, was the most dangerous thing that the library contained. Because a human being who has access to that map does not need an intermediary, does not need an institution to tell them what is real, does not need a church or a state or any other structure of external authority to mediate their relationship with the deepest aspects of their own nature. And that, throughout all of human history, has been the most threatening knowledge of all. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria did not happen in a single night. This is the first thing that the standard historical account gets wrong. Most people have a vague image of Julius Caesar accidentally setting fire to the library during his siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE, or perhaps of the Muslim Caliph Omar ordering its destruction in 642 CE, with the famous statement that books contradicting the Quran should be burned and books agreeing with it were unnecessary. Both of these stories are, at best, partial and distorted versions of a much more complex reality. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was a process that unfolded over several centuries, and it had a clear logic and a clear sequence. The first and most significant phase of the destruction began not with fire but with policy. In the early centuries of the Common Era, as the Roman Empire became increasingly Christian, under the influence of a series of emperors, beginning with Constantine in the 4th century. The ideological framework that had made the Library of Alexandria possible, the Greek philosophical tradition of free inquiry, the Hellenistic synthesis of multiple wisdom traditions, the Egyptian understanding that knowledge was sacred regardless of its source, was systematically dismantled. The library did not need to be burned immediately. It needed to be defunded, isolated, denied the scholarly community that gave it life, stripped of the protection that had allowed it to gather knowledge from every tradition without restriction. This process took approximately 3 centuries, from the early 4th century CE to the early 7th. But within this process, there was a specific sequence, a specific order in which different categories of knowledge became targets. The first category to be targeted, the first knowledge to be identified as incompatible with the emerging institutional Christianity that was becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, was precisely the category that the library had been most successful in synthesizing. The inner knowledge, the knowledge of consciousness, the Egyptian mystery school tradition, the Neoplatonic philosophical schools that had developed in Alexandria itself, schools that had synthesized the Egyptian mystical tradition with the Greek philosophical tradition and the Indian contemplative tradition into the most sophisticated understanding of the nature of consciousness that the ancient Western world had produced. The Gnostic traditions, which we explored in a previous conversation, which had developed within early Christianity itself, and which preserved the inner teaching that the institutional church found most threatening. The hermetic tradition, which claimed to transmit the wisdom of the Egyptian god Thoth, and which described the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the divine with a precision that the emerging institutional religion could not accommodate. These were the first things targeted, not the astronomy, not the mathematics, not the medicine, the maps of consciousness, because the maps of consciousness were the most dangerous knowledge of all. Let us be specific about what was lost, because this is not merely a historical question. It is a question about the nature of the knowledge that the modern world has inherited, and the nature of the knowledge that the modern world has not inherited. The Neoplatonic school of Alexandria, centered on figures like Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Hypatia, had developed, over 3 centuries of systematic investigation, the most complete philosophical description of the nature of consciousness ever produced in the Western tradition. Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century CE and who is considered the founder of Neoplatonism, described the structure of reality in terms that are strikingly consistent with the Vedantic tradition of ancient India, with the Egyptian mystery tradition, and with what modern contemplative neuroscience is beginning to find. At the highest level of reality, Plotinus described what he called the One, the infinite, undivided, self-sufficient ground of all existence, not a being that exists alongside other beings, not a god in the personal sense, but the absolute ground from which all existence arises. What the Vedic tradition calls Brahman, what the Egyptian tradition calls Nun, what the Sufi tradition calls the divine essence. Below the One, Plotinus described Nous, the divine intelligence, the principle of self-aware, knowing that is the first expression of the One. And below Nous, the soul, the level of reality at which consciousness becomes individuated, at which the one divine awareness expresses itself in the form of particular finite embodied beings. And at the center of this system, the point that made it genuinely revolutionary, genuinely dangerous to those who wished to maintain a structure of external religious authority, was the claim that every human being, at the deepest level of their being, is directly connected to the One, not through the mediation of a church, not through the intercession of a priest, not through correct belief in specific doctrines, through the direct investigation of the nature of their own consciousness. Plotinus described specific practices, what he called the return, through which a human being could turn awareness back toward its own source and directly recognize its identity with the divine ground of all existence. This is identical to what the Egyptian mystery schools were teaching, identical to what the Upanishads describe, identical to what the Sufi tradition calls fana. identical to what the Buddhist tradition calls awakening. And it was precisely this, the teaching that every human being has direct, unmediated access to the divine ground of reality through their own consciousness, that was identified as the most dangerous knowledge in the library, because it made the institutional church unnecessary. Hypatia of Alexandria, the last great scholar of the Neoplatonic tradition, a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher of extraordinary brilliance, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE. Her murder is often presented as the symbolic end of the ancient world, the moment at which the light of Greek philosophy was extinguished by religious fanaticism. But it was more specific than that. Hypatia was murdered not because she was a philosopher or a mathematician. She was murdered because she was the living transmission of the inner knowledge, the keeper of the maps of consciousness that the emerging institutional Christianity was most desperate to suppress. Now we need to address the question that this history raises directly. Was the destruction of the inner knowledge complete? The answer is no, and understanding why it was not complete, understanding where the knowledge survived, how it was preserved, and what form it takes today, is the most practically important part of this entire conversation. The knowledge survived in several ways. The first was physical concealment. When the Neoplatonic schools were closed and the scholars dispersed in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, some of the most important texts were hidden, copied and transported to places where they would be safe, to monasteries in the Egyptian desert, to isolated communities in Syria and Persia, to the margins of the Roman Empire where institutional control was weakest. Some of these texts were lost. Many were found again, centuries later, in circumstances that seemed almost miraculous. Like the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts in 1945, buried in a ceramic jar in the Egyptian desert, hidden there 16 centuries before by someone who understood their value and their danger. The second way the knowledge survived was through transmission, not in texts but in people, in the unbroken lineages of teachers and students that carried the inner knowledge from generation to generation, sometimes openly, sometimes in code, sometimes disguised within the outer forms of the very religious institutions that had tried to destroy it. The Sufi orders preserved it within Islam. The Kabbalistic lineages preserved it within Judaism. The Christian mystical tradition, the Desert Fathers, the Rhineland mystics, the contemplative orders, preserved it within Christianity itself, always in tension with the institutional church, always vulnerable to suppression, but never entirely extinguished. The third way the knowledge survived was through the Islamic world. When the Arab armies conquered Alexandria in 642 CE, they did not burn the library. The library had already been largely destroyed or dispersed by that point. What they did do was preserve, translate, and transmit the Greek philosophical texts that had survived, including the Neoplatonic texts that contained the inner knowledge. For several centuries, the Islamic world was the custodian of the ancient wisdom that Europe had lost. The great translators of Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries preserved Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, and the hermetic texts, and transmitted them back to Europe through the Islamic universities of Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries. This transmission was the spark that ignited the European Renaissance. and at the heart of the Renaissance. In the Platonic Academy of Florence, in the work of Marsilio Ficino, who translated the complete works of Plato and the hermetic texts into Latin for the first time. The inner knowledge that had been suppressed for 1,000 years began to resurface. Not completely, not without distortion, not without the continuing pressure of institutional religion that could not accommodate what it contained. But it survived. It has always survived. Let us now look at what this history means for the present moment, because this is not ancient history in the sense of something that happened long ago and has no bearing on the world you are living in now. The suppression of the inner knowledge, the systematic attempt to remove from public awareness the maps of consciousness that the ancient world had developed, did not end with the burning of Alexandria or the murder of Hypatia. It continued in different forms with different instruments across the subsequent centuries. The Cathar movement in medieval France, which preserved a version of the Gnostic inner teaching within Christianity, was destroyed in the Albigensian Crusade of the 13th century, one of the most brutal military campaigns of the medieval period. The Knights Templar, who had encountered the inner knowledge during the Crusades and were beginning to transmit it within their order, were suppressed in the early 14th century, their leaders tortured and burned. The Renaissance transmission of the hermetic texts, which was producing the most sophisticated synthesis of inner wisdom and outer science that Europe had seen since Alexandria, was disrupted by the Counter-Reformation of the 16th century, which identified the hermetic tradition as a threat to institutional religious authority. And in the modern world, in the era of mass education, mass media and mass culture, the suppression continues in a different and in some ways more effective form. Not through burning, not through murder, through marginalization, through the systematic relegation of the inner knowledge to the category of the mystical, the irrational, the pre-scientific, unsuitable for serious intellectual consideration, unworthy of the attention of educated adults who have been trained to evaluate claims through the methods of empirical science. The result is a world in which billions of people have access to more information than any previous generation in human history, and almost no access to the most important knowledge that their ancestors possessed. The knowledge of what they actually are. The maps of consciousness that the ancient world spent thousands of years developing, that the Library of Alexandria gathered and began to synthesize, that have been suppressed, hidden and marginalized across 2,000 years of institutional effort. Those maps are still available. They have always been available, but finding them requires knowing where to look and knowing that there is something to look for. If you have followed this conversation from the founding of the Library of Alexandria to the murder of Hypatia, from the Neoplatonic description of consciousness to the hidden survival of the inner knowledge across 2,000 years of suppression, then something has happened that I want to acknowledge directly. You have been given a piece of context that most people alive today do not have. You know that the world you were born into, a world in which the inner knowledge is marginalized, dismissed, and largely invisible, is not the natural state of human civilization. It is the result of a specific historical process, a process that had specific agents, specific motivations, and specific targets. And you know that the knowledge that was targeted, the maps of consciousness that the ancient world had developed and that the Library of Alexandria had gathered, was targeted precisely because it was the most powerful knowledge available to a human being, the knowledge of what you actually are. This knowledge was not destroyed, it survived in the Sufi lineages and the Kabbalistic traditions, in the Christian mystical schools and the Tibetan monasteries, in the Vedantic philosophical schools of India, which were never disrupted by the events that disrupted the Western transmission, in the alchemical tradition that Newton studied, in the Neoplatonic philosophy that was transmitted through the Islamic world to the European Renaissance. And it is available now in a form that has never been more accessible in the history of Western civilization, not because the suppression has ended, but because the transmission has persisted. Because human beings in every generation have chosen to carry what they were given forward, despite the pressure to be silent, despite the institutional incentives to conform, despite the marginalization and the dismissal and the occasional genuine danger. The flame has not gone out. That is why this channel exists. That is what the name means. At Sacred Flame, every video we make is an act of transmission, an attempt to pass forward in a form accessible to people living in the 21st century what the ancient world discovered about the nature of consciousness, what the Library of Alexandria gathered, and what the burning tried to destroy. Subscribe if this work matters to you, because the next videos go deeper into the specific traditions that preserved the inner knowledge most completely, into the specific practices they developed, and into the practical reality of what it means to apply these maps in an actual human life. And share this with someone who has always sensed that something important was missing from the version of reality they were given. They are right, and now they know why. We began tonight by saying that the Library of Alexandria contained the most important knowledge in the ancient world. And we said that what made it so important and what made its destruction so significant was not the astronomy or the mathematics or the medicine. It was the inner knowledge, the maps of consciousness, the systematic, rigorous, cross-cultural investigation of the nature of human awareness gathered from the Egyptian mystery schools, the Greek philosophical tradition, the Babylonian and Persian wisdom traditions, the Indian contemplative lineages, and beginning to be synthesized into the most complete picture of the nature of the human being that the ancient world had ever produced. That synthesis was what was burned first, not because the people who ordered the burning were stupid, not because they failed to understand the value of what they were destroying, but because they understood it perfectly. They understood that a human being who has access to a complete map of their own consciousness, who knows what they actually are at the deepest level, who has direct access to the ground of their own awareness without the need for institutional mediation, is a human being who cannot be fully controlled, cannot be made to believe something they have directly verified to be false, cannot be made to depend on an external authority for access to their own inner life. And throughout all of human history, the most consistent motivation for the suppression of the inner knowledge has been exactly this. Not theology, not morality, power. The ancient world understood that consciousness is the most fundamental reality, that the investigation of the nature of awareness is the most important investigation available to a human being, that the maps developed through that investigation are the most valuable knowledge in existence. And for 2,000 years, a sustained effort has been made to prevent that knowledge from being widely available. The effort has not succeeded. The knowledge survives. In the Upanishads, that the Vedic tradition preserved through every disruption that history threw at it. In the Tibetan Buddhist lineages that carried their transmission across the destruction of their homeland in the 20th century. In the Sufi orders and the Kabbalistic schools and the Christian contemplative traditions that kept the inner knowledge alive within the very institutions that were trying to suppress it. In the texts of the hermetic tradition that were hidden in the Islamic world and transmitted to the European Renaissance. In the alchemical manuscripts that Newton studied in secret. In the Neoplatonic philosophy that Hypatia taught and died for. The Library of Alexandria burned. But what it contained, the essential recognition about the nature of consciousness and the nature of what a human being actually is, was never contained in any building. It was always in people, in the awareness of every human being who has ever turned attention back towards its own source and recognized what was always already there. That awareness is available to you right now, in this moment. The burning did not reach it. The burning never could. Until next time, stay awake,